Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's webinar, Practical Solutions to Real HR Shared Services Dilemmas, Getting from Good to Great. As a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are muted. This is the Q&A tool located to the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them. We will answer questions real time during the presentation as well as at the end. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides and the recording in a few days. And I would now like to pass the presentation off to the Human Capital Management Principal Research Lead, Alyssa Tucker.
Welcome to APQC's Human Capital Management June webinar on the topic of HR Shared Services. For years, HR Shared Services has been among APQC's most popular human capital management topic areas. And I think this interest is likely due to the huge benefits that HR Shared Services can bring to organizations, as well as to the challenges that come with establishing and maturing an HR Shared Services organization. So today's speakers are experts on these subjects. They will introduce a proven framework for determining if HR Shared Services operations are aligned with leading practices, and they'll offer practical solutions for closing gaps in HR Shared Services performance. So first, I'd like to give you a bit of background on each of our speakers. Courtney Jackson has nearly 25 years of consulting experience, focusing the last 16 years in corporate and shared services. Areas of expertise include HR and financial management, operating model strategy, design, and implementation, human capital management technology, evaluation and implementation, and project and change management, operations improvement, process redesign, organizational redesign, and governance. Courtney has experience in healthcare, higher education, energy, aerospace and defense, entertainment, and retail, primarily within the HR and finance and accounting disciplines. Our next speaker is Patricia Ferris. She joined Scott Madden in 2004. Her consulting experience spans a number of areas in human capital management, including operations improvement and process redesign, service delivery model and organizational design, merger and acquisition integration, strategy development, and project management. Jonathan Luck began his career at Scott Madden as an MBA intern in 2014. Jonathan specializes in assessment, design, and implementation of shared services for human resources and finance. His current areas of expertise include business process automation, project management, financial analysis, supporting technology implementation, and change management. So with that, I'd like to turn the webinar over to our speakers from Scott Madden.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thank you all for joining us today. We are going to start by just telling you a little bit about Scott Madden, and then we will jump into the topics for today, which are really around an assessment framework that we use, that we help organizations and what we believe gets them from good to great. And we'll talk through some real life case studies, and then we will do a short wrap up at the end. So just a little bit about who we are. We are a general management consulting firm. We have been in existence for over 35 years, and we have been doing corporate and shared services work since the early 1990s. So we feel we are a pioneer in this space. We work across a variety of functions, although certainly a large part of our work is in HR. We also work within finance and accounting, IT, supply chain, and then some of the other administrative functions like legal, facilities, sales, and marketing. We have completed more than 2,100 projects since the early 90s, and they really span across a variety of industries, as well as really the spectrum of companies that are in the very initial stages where you are evaluating, is this the right strategic decision, through planning, through building and implementing a new service delivery model. We also help with stabilization and also continuous process improvement. Next, you can see our representative clients. You'll see, as I mentioned, we work across a variety of industries, and many of these logos I'm sure you will recognize. These are the clients that allow us to publish their logos. Thankfully, we certainly have many, many more, but just giving you an idea of the various sorts of companies that we work within, as well as the industries. We have seen a big uptick, I would say, over the last few years within the higher ed, public sector, and defense industry, as well as healthcare and professional services. Those are some of our organizations that tend to be a little lower in the maturity curve. And with that, we can transition into paving the road to success. So just a little bit of context before we jump into the framework today. We really strongly believe no matter where you are in your shared services journey, opportunities exist. This could be for companies that are in the very initial startup phases, which we define as years 0 to 1. And the focus there becomes really around policy harmonization, process redesign, understanding what the new organizational structure will look like, evaluating your technology capabilities and/or the roadmap for future technology implementation, and establishing a governance model. As you enter into the growth period, which is defined as companies in that 1 to 3 year post-implementation, the focus really continues on process redesign. We know that although we'd all like to get 100% of those processes in top shape in the early days, that's not always the case. So process redesign continues to be a focus area, as do expansion opportunities that start to occur. Once you're up and running, oftentimes companies will see opportunities to bring in more and more scope, which is certainly a testament to the value of the service delivery model. Additionally, within this growth period, you may be looking at additional technology investments or integrating with the technologies that exist, as well as perhaps bringing in different functions. You may have an opportunity to move from a single function to more of a global business services operation. And then in the mature stages, which we define as over 3 years, continuous improvement is certainly first and foremost in this area. That may include even more expansion opportunities, really continuing to focus on customer satisfaction or user experience, technology optimization, global business services, multifunction optimization. So some of the things you may have identified during that 1 to 3 year time, and just continuing along that curve to really push the envelope to get better and better. And why is this important? This is one aspect of why this is important. As you can see here, as organizations mature, a lot of the benchmarking and the performance metrics tell us that there's a lot of benefits to this. This is what you'll see here is actually one slide, one view out of a benchmarking survey that Scott Madden does every other year with APQC. We'll talk a little bit more about how you can potentially be involved in this in the future, but this was from our last cycle in 2019. And what we found was that at a median level for total employees served per total HR headcount, from a maturity viewpoint, in the first year, under the first year, you're still operating at about 1 to 107. For those companies that are more in the 5 to 10 or over 10-year time frame, that headcount efficiency really doubles in terms of optimizing how the operations are working. There are a lot of underlying factors that are driving this, like optimization of technology, including perhaps an ERP system that is highly functioning, or service management technologies that are working very well, or that global business services type of model that I mentioned. But this just gives you a feeling and a perspective on how this can work and why it's important to continue up that maturity curve. So with that, what we want to do today is talk a little bit about the framework that we have developed that allows us to really consider and evaluate organizations that, again, are in any phase of that maturity. And what you'll hear a lot of times is the old three-legged stool. It's really important to focus on people, process, technologies. And we certainly agree, although we have expanded that view into a 4-quadrant view, and we've also included data and knowledge in that as well. We think these are all really important components of the infrastructure that can get you from a good operating service delivery model to a great one. So with that, I think we can move on, and we'll start to dive into each of these in a bit more detail, and I will hand it over to Trish.
Thanks, Courtney. We're going to start by talking about people in organization. When we think about people in organization, what we're thinking about is organizational structure. So how are you organized? What does your staffing look like? work activities, so who's doing what work, what are the roles and responsibilities in training and development. So Courtney mentioned there are some characteristics of our leading clients, and people who have shared services who are doing things particularly well. And in each of our quadrants, there are some characteristics that we look at where some folks stand out more than others. When we talk about people and organization, some of those characteristics are around the things we show here. So first, when we think about governance, governance is very important. However, it looks different at every client. So some are more formal than others. Some governance structures are large, some are smaller. But what's important is making sure that there is governance around who has decision-making rights, who's deciding what services are in or out of a service center, how are issues raised and resolved. Those are the kind of things that are important. Some of those structures have people, depending on if you have your global business services, those may be multi-function governance structures. Role and work alignment and clarity is very important. One of the things that we find for people who have not started shared services, or even some who haven't done it well, is there's a lack of role clarity. So we always find people, there's a little bit, people are doing a little bit of everything. So they're not exactly sure. In the interest of serving their clients, they get involved in everything, trying to help their clients. And what that does is it really mucks things up. And people that do that well, the roles are very clear. So the swim lanes are clear. People know what they're responsible for versus what their peers are responsible for. And that's documented very clearly, and people are trained on that, so they know what handoffs look like, or where they should be sending people to get the best service and to get themselves out of processes. Tiered service delivery model, so most are familiar with that. That's the tier 0 self-service, tier 1, tier 2 structure. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. Competency alignment, super important, and it's really critical in the success of a leading practice service delivery model. So once you get the roles and responsibilities clear and the job set up and the organization aligned, are the right people doing the right jobs? Do they have the right skills to perform those jobs? So we see this a lot in the business partner population. So oftentimes, we remove the administrative and transactional work from the business partners, and the expectation is that they'll be doing more strategic work and more consultative work, but oftentimes they don't have the skills to do that. So there are some considerations there around, do we have the right people in the roles in our new model? And do we need to upskill them? What skills do they need to be successful? Employee engagement is important in every organization, every department. HR, shared services is no different. And then lastly is career paths and development. So some of our successful clients are really using this model and the shared services environment to promote career pathing. So the service center can be a really great launching point for other careers in HR. It provides exposure to a number of the HR functions, to clients, and to other peers in HR. So we see a lot of times, people that are successful in that shared services organization move on to other roles and grow in the HR organization, whether it's in a COE role or a business partner role, or they may move across. So before we get into the case studies, when we talk about a leading practices model, what are we talking about? Again, a lot of people are familiar with the shared services delivery model, but we always like to level set because sometimes there are some nuances between different models and people's perception of the models. So looking at the left, that's our customer base, so the vendors, employees, and managers. And what we're trying to do for those groups is give them simple access to HR information and get inquiries. Their entry points are that middle, those middle icons that with the box around it. So what we really want to drive is direct access. So that's the tier 0, so self-service. Next would be the tier 1s and 2s, the service center. So in the service center, the tier 1s handle the basic Q&A and some of that basic administrative and transactional work, those really repeatable tasks. Tier 2, in our model, what we see in tier 2 are more specialized roles. They're usually aligned to a process or function. So for tier 2, we see things like payroll, leave of absence, employee relations. So those are things that usually require a little more expertise. They may be more complicated. People in those roles usually have more experience in that function or with those processes or tools. We do see some people set up a tier 2 as an escalation point, so handling, not necessarily functionally aligned, but handling more complex Q&A. But we find that, again, kind of muddies the water, and it just gives another escalation point within the model. Then we look at our HR business partners. So you see the HR business partners are really, their role is to partner with the business in talent management and workforce planning, really furthering the objectives and the goals of the business. So they're the advisory, consultative, kind of strategic partnership part of the model. There's an arrow there directly to managers, as you see. So that's the work, the partnership that they're supposed to be having. And then there are the COEs. So the COEs are really the ones who design and deploy the functional programs. They are the experts in their functions in HR. They're also an escalation path. So they can handle more complex policy questions and issues. They are partnering with the business partners to understand what the businesses need and how to make those functions better. And then underneath you see continuous improvement, and that really goes across all. So all of the channels work together, and there's a constant eye towards continuous improvement and making the model better. Let's jump into our first case study. So in this situation, our client was a global professional services organization. They had many different types of employees, different employee personas, different wants and needs from HR. They had established their own service delivery model, and they called us in to kind of evaluate and help them improve the service and the customer experience in the model that they had in place. So the way their model was set up, they had outsourced the tier 1 help desk. They had also set up what they called this tier 1.5, that was an internal group that handled a lot of the escalations that came out of that outsourced group. In addition, they had set up their own support functions for many of the COEs. So for example, they had an administrative group within benefits. They had another one within their HRIS team that was Workday operations. So they had a number of mini models in their overall service delivery model. In addition, their knowledge sources were very disparate and very complex to access. So they had over 65 websites that had HR content. The entry points were difficult. People did not know where to find stuff. And so what was happening was people would just go to whoever they knew to try to get HR information. And a lot of times that resulted in being passed around to other people because even the HR professional that they went to couldn't necessarily find the information or didn't know where to go. So the objective of our work with them was to design a model that really considered the user experience, incorporating the feedback from stakeholders and leading practice to really optimize and improve the customer satisfaction. So what we did, we started with a baseline assessment. So really understanding how the work was being performed. They didn't even really have a great grasp on it at the time. We did that through interviews and then our work activity assessment, which is something that we do with a lot of our clients to get a quick understanding of who's doing what and how much that is costing the organization. And then we did an analysis of their policies and processes. We really looked closely at the technologies and tools and looked at their metrics. one of the things we focused on in metrics, because one of their questions was, should we bring our tier 1 back in-house? So thankfully, because they had an agreement with an outsourcer, they had some metrics around their case management and Q&A and responses and things like that we could evaluate. So out of that, we got a really good picture of what was happening. And as we expected, and as I mentioned earlier, the picture was a lot of people touching a lot of things. Everyone was, in the best interest of their customers, really trying to help them out, but that involved them getting involved in a lot. And people were really having a hard time, as I mentioned, getting access to HR information. So things took a while. The other big finding was that tier 1.5 group was getting a lot of escalation. So there were a lot of handoffs from the outsourced provider. There was a lot that they couldn't answer that was being handled internally anyway. So we set out to design a future state. We looked at all the components and helped them design a future state. And then we looked at implementation planning. So what were the things that they needed to do to be able to reach that future state, understanding their resource limitations that they had, other initiatives going on, and looking at how that would all work. We also really looked at the risks that what would happen if we kept things the way that they were, and risks that might happen with the change that was going to be required to move to this new model. So what happened? So we redesigned their model, which looked much more aligned to kind of the leading practice model that we recommend. Of course, it had some components that were unique to them, as we have to all of our clients. But one of the main things was they planned to move the tier 1 back in-house. It was clear that their internal HR resources were handling so many of the cases anyway, and the satisfaction was very low, both with HR and from employees with that outsourced provider. That it didn't make sense. They were not getting the gains that they wanted or needed out of outsourcing that tier 1 help desk. We made a roadmap and some very clear recommendations on how to improve the technology. So how are we going to work to get those 65 websites down to a more manageable number? What was the user interface going to look like? How could employees and managers access the information more easily? And then from all the recommendations, we put together a roadmap. So again, there are resource constraints and other initiatives to balance, which we see all the time. And so it was factoring those things in to decide, okay, what can we do in the near term to get ourselves ready? What are the things that are quick wins? So what are the things we can do right now to make things better? And then it was kind of our near-term activities. So over the next 6 to 10 months, what can we do to really start moving to this model? And then long-term, what could we do? What are the things that we could do to continue to expand? And this is an organization that was planning some large expansion, particularly in Europe. And so they wanted to understand, so what does it look like as we expand to Europe, and how do we expand this model to be more broad and serve that European population? And what is that going to look like for our future service centers? I'll pause for a moment to see if there are any questions before we move to our next quadrant.
Thank you so much, Trish. We only have one question right now, and I'm going to hold it because I think it's on the topic that you guys are going to get to in a little bit. So I'm going to hold that right now. But I will encourage listeners, if you do have questions, please submit them throughout the presentation, and we'll try to stop and address them if they relate, to what we're talking about at that moment. So thank you so much, Trish.
Okay, our next quadrant is policy and process. So I think most people are familiar with policy and process. Most people know that, policy and process, we should have our policies documented, and, our process should be streamlined. But this is a major area where we see people say that they need help, particularly global organizations who have grown through acquisition, organizations who have had fairly independent business units. Sometimes this becomes much more complex. When we think about policy and process, we're also considering the infrastructure and the tools to support those processes. Not necessarily the technology, although they're related, but procedures, standard operating procedures, or reports, or some of those things that are also in support of policies and process. So the characteristics of this most effective policy and process work. So the very first thing is the scope of services. So this is really foundational to all the work in shared services. And what this is it's a very detailed list of the activities that are done in the HR function and who performs those activities. And it includes everyone. It is the business partners, the COEs, the service center, self-service, vendors if it's an outsourced service, but it's a very clear picture of what that is. And then for global organizations, it often goes even deeper because there may be differences. So for example, if a process is conducted differently in a different region and handled by somebody different, that would be noted in the scope of services. Or if there's processes that are specific to a certain country, those processes would also be included, but noted that it's only done in Japan, for example. Harmonized and simplified policies. So we all want harmonized policies. It makes it so much easier, but we rarely find that we can 100% harmonize policies. But often there's a way to look at them and harmonize to the extent possible. So extent possible. So we are limited by regional or local requirements sometimes. Grandfathered business units. There are a number of things that can limit that, but we want to try to harmonize to the extent possible, and we also want to make sure those are documented. Documenting the policies and having streamlined, harmonized policies, those are inputs into your knowledge-based content, which is very important. That's where employees and managers are going to find information. And they're also often, for many of our clients who are doing HCM system implementations, they're key into the setup and design of their HCM system. So oftentimes this has to be done before that as well. They also drive processes. So in order to know how to conduct a process, sometimes there are policy decisions that drive the process. Optimized processes, that's not just an HR thing, but optimized processes are important. So streamlining, taking advantage of technology, getting rid of the handoffs, getting rid of manual aspects, etc. Documenting any supporting tools and templates, defining ownership and governance, so who owns the process, who's responsible for making the updates, who's responsible for keeping track of any policy changes that need to be made, and then a focused continuous improvement. So continuous improvement, really making sure everything is staying fresh and not stale. Document all the processes and then put them up on a shelf. It's looking at them to make sure they're working as intended. If they're not, working with customers and HR users to understand why they're not working, to try to fix them. But it's constantly looking to evolve and making processes better. Oftentimes, this is a dedicated team or dedicated resources that are looking at this. So really looking at the processes themselves, looking at the metrics, and reaching out and building relationships with the users and the users and customers to make sure that the processes are working. I just focused on most of this as we talked about what the levers are. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the scope of services. One thing I didn't mention is the scope of services really needs to be agreed upon. It's usually a group activity at the leadership level, but involving resources below that to understand, how things actually work. And then at the leadership level, having an understanding of who owns what and what's going to be done in which way, particularly for complex organizations. We find in these discussions, these are often like workshops to come to agreement here. This is where, you know, we'll get into some of the details, and somebody may raise their hand and say, you know, there's no way that can be done in the service center because we need a wet signature on that form. So actually that's got to move here, but it's that level of detail and that level of agreement and understanding. We talked about the policy and process. One thing I will say here, it's much easier if you have good technology, it's much easier to support non-harmonized policies than it is to support non-standard processes. So if you have good technology that is, you know, aligned by user, so it knows exactly who I am and where I work and what my role is, then you can adapt the policies or the knowledge-based content to me as a user. You can do that, like I said, with good technology. It becomes more complicated the more that you have, but it can be done. On the process side, if you are performing processes differently for different employee populations or different businesses or different employee types, it starts becoming complicated and you start losing efficiency. You're not going to get the same efficiency from your shared services that you would get if those were standardized. The other thing that makes it more complicated is oftentimes the technology is set up to support processes. So it may cost more, or it may require customization to be able to execute processes differently. Let's get into a case study on policy and process. So this case study, for this client, it was a global organization. So they were in over 40 countries, and they supported a heavily matrixed and rapidly growing business. The way the business was set up, it is very complicated, reporting relationships, and again, very dispersed employee population. They had very different employee types. They had, you know, the office employees, and they also had plant populations, so that there was a big mix of employee types. Their issue, their head count, to support all of this complexity, their HR head count was growing at the same rate as their employee head count, which could not continue to happen because they were continuing to grow into the foreseeable future. So to address this, they were doing two things. They had two transformations underway. They were doing a broad service delivery transformation, and they were also implementing an HCM system at the same time. So we supported broad efforts on the service delivery model transformation, but the focus of this is really talking about the policy and process work, which was a key input into both the service delivery model transformation as well as the system implementation. So as you can see in my box here, little box here, so they started out, they had 1,100 HR policies. So trying to build knowledge-based content and trying to move towards self-service in an employee portal, this had to be, you know, streamlined and organized. And additionally, they were preparing for this HCM implementation. They needed to get their arms around what their policies were as an input into the design of their system. So for this piece of work, the first thing we did, we worked with the client to do a current state inventory and assessment. So we went out and collected and worked with subject matter experts across the globe to collect all of the existing documentation. So local, regional, global, and try to get our arms around everything that was out there. We worked with subject matter experts, and we broke into teams of subject matter experts with representation across the globe to start to analyze and look at these. So in the future state design piece involved doing a very detailed policy and process analysis, document by document, and trying to get our arms around which policies, while they may be called something different, were actually the same. What was the work that we needed to do to get them to be the same? Even things like titling. I think the boxes are small here, but you can see leave of absences was a huge one. So there were 547 leave of absence policies. Many of them were titled something different. So the policy itself may have been the same, but one might call it maternity leave, one might call it family leave. The terminology even was all over the place. PTO or vacation, what were they calling it? And did it matter? Sometimes it did matter. There was a difference. But looking at all those different leaves, leave types, different categories, again, the maternity, the paternity, the adoption, the family, and looking across to try to understand, where the differences actually were, where it was just word differences, and then also looking at, what was really just, we just need to clean up the words here, or this is just really long and it needs to be shortened. So some of that was just cleaning up the policy itself. The policies were fine, but needed to be cleaned up. We were also looking to, get them in a way that was organized so that we could increase the accessibility to them. Some of them were missing, so we may have had policies in certain regions that we didn't have in other regions. We were also looking at the processes. So the processes, documentation varied widely. There was documentation for some things, not documentation for other things. A lot of things were tribal knowledge, so it's getting that stuff down on paper and understanding how things worked. And again, because they were very complex and all over the globe, it was understanding what the differences were in each of the regions or countries, or even the work locations. Out of that, we created a prioritized plan to get to harmonization or streamlining the policies and the processes. So for the policies, they were prioritized in ways, so what were going to be our quick wins, what were things we could do easily, what really were just these needed to be cleaned up, or we just needed to include these other locations that it's applicable to them, but they just weren't initially included, versus what was going to be very difficult to harmonize or what probably was not going to be harmonized. So some of those, the CHRO said, you know what, that is not happening. That's not going to be changing anytime in the next year or two. So that's on our low priority list. What were the high volume ones? Leave of absence was one in particular, right? So what are the ones that employees are asking questions about? We probably need, if we're going to try to build out a portal and a knowledge base, we're probably going to need to tackle those because people are going to be asking questions. And then lastly, on both the policy and the process front, what are the ones that are going to impact our HCM system setup and architecture? So we want to get those aligned so that we're ready to go for our architecture sessions for our HCM implementation. So what were we able to do? We decommissioned a lot of the policies, over 25% of them, cleaned up the nomenclature, we simplified a lot of them. A lot of it was, there's a lot of legalese, there was process and procedure language in some of the policies. And then we harmonized as much as we could where we were allowed. On the processes, we documented over 150 future state HR processes. We incorporated the user experience, which there were user experience mapping had been done for them. So we incorporated the user experience into those maps, and we were able to leverage those processes for the system design. We were also, through this process, able to engage a number of stakeholders, which served as a great change management exercise because their voices were in the policy decisions and in the process decisions, understanding how things worked. And they became really great change agents and communicators to others in their organization and in their function, saying, this is why we do things this way, or you guys are never going to believe they do this differently over there, and it's so much better. And really, helping and supporting the process along the way. I will say this was an organization that was very resource constrained. Again, they were preparing for an HCM implementation, and so they were resource constrained, but we were able to organize the work in a way that we would work with subject matter experts in different groups at different times and work with them based on timing and their timing and availability, and in smaller groups, although they were inclusive groups, global groups, that made sense, back to the kind of prioritization and the planning piece of it. We ended up with much better policies, great input into the knowledge base and into the system design, and much more streamlined processes where people were really bought in, and it was leveraging leading practices, both based on the technology, based on leading practices in HR and leading practices that they uncovered in their organization. Any pause for questions again? Any questions related to policy or process?
Yes, Trish, I'm going to ask you that question because it relates to global complexity as well as country-specific processes. So the question is, how do you recommend domestic companies address U.S. state regulations when they're adopting a work-from-anywhere approach to talent acquisition? So how do you deal with U.S. state regulations when an employee can work from anywhere?
Oh, you're asking me like regulatory questions. I am not a legal expert.
From a process standpoint.
From a process standpoint, yeah, absolutely. From a process standpoint, I mean, it's very important. I will not give out legal advice, but from a process standpoint, what we find is important is you know, really understanding the regulations that are required and making sure, again, it's back to like documentation and tracking and ownership. So some organizations, you know, other things come into play here too, like pay equity and, you know, pay rates. When you're starting to work from home anywhere, you know, are we still competitive in our pay? Are our benefits still competitive? Taxation, there's a whole host of things. So the first part is setting, you know, your company strategy. So what are we as a company going to do around this? And are we willing to go to, you know, really work from wherever, or are we not? And then even if it's limiting, you know, deciding what those places are, and then very much understanding what the regulations are and how you need to support those employees, how you need to hire them, how you need to support, like really going through the employee life cycle and understanding to make sure you're in compliance, and then documentation. You know, making sure your processes can support it. If you have a knowledge base in place or policies in place, you need to update your policies. Do you need to update your knowledge base, et cetera, making sure, you know, really ticking all the boxes once you understand what those are. In a service center environment, we find that to be easier because oftentimes if it's done right, you have the documentation. So you have the place to update it, right? You have the operational procedures to go through as if you were acquiring a new company, or as if you were, it's much more straightforward. Everything should be documented and managed, and you have groups who are dealing with that. So you're not usually looking to update things like, oh, we have to do that. Oh, you know, it's over here. Oh, who do we have to talk to about that? It's usually fairly controlled if there's good governance in place and good infrastructure, that it makes it a little bit easier.
That's great. And I just from the same listener, I don't quite understand this question, so I'll see if you do. If not, we'll ask her to connect with you after the webinar. She's wondering if, she says, is using a POE or an EOR a recommended approach? So it's kind of a follow-on to that question you just answered. I don't know if you understand those acronyms or not.
I don't know what those are.
Yeah,
John or Courtney, do you know the PO?
Okay.
Not jumping out to me.
I'll encourage this listener to, we will have contact information for everyone at the end of the webinar to reach out directly to get more clarification. And we do have one more question. What are the best practices or criteria that you need to identify the topics or the processes that should be supported in layer 1 or layer 2? So tier 1 or tier 2. How do you identify what processes go?
Sure. So when we work with our clients, there are some that we see 99% of the time. So that's kind of our starting list. And then we work, that's part of that scope of services exercise. We look at tasks and think about what are the repeatable, you know, what can be documented, what is repeatable, what doesn't require a certain level of expertise to be able to support it, right? What can we document? How can our technology support it? So that's kind of the things that we're looking at. The different distinction between tier 1 and tier 2, that's also, it's a little bit nuanced, but it's usually, for most clients, that's not as difficult because they know they have things in their organization, in their functions, so they know. Like I said, payroll is a common one. There's the basic Q&A of payroll, which usually can be handled by tier 1, but there's some payroll pieces like that are working with the vendor or doing, specialized actions in payroll that really require getting into the payroll system, and those pieces that you would lean you to, well, it's fairly common, it's somewhat repeatable, but it really needs a specialist. Same with leave of absence. So somebody who understands the regulations usually, again, people who are used to working with the vendors, depending what's in scope for leave of absence, but it's tracking it, really staying on top of it, partnering with the business partners for the return to work, all of those pieces. It just tends to be more complex than the basic Q&A.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you go on and encourage listeners to keep bringing in the questions, and we'll do another Q&A session in a little bit.
Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and take you all through the last two quadrants here. So next up is really around the tools and technology. So when we talk about tools and technology, we're really referring to ERP systems or some of your service management technologies, any kind of an intelligent automation that you're able to incorporate, your different applications or self-service, along with some of the workflow behind the process and or analytics that are involved when it comes to data. So thinking about service management, for me, I always think about the core four. So your employee portal, your case management system, ideally a knowledge base that's going to be available to your employees, along with any kind of e-forms that are available and all of that, again, automated routing or workflows. When we talk about standardization and integration, so obviously Trish was just talking a bit about standardization and harmonization on policies. Again, I think that's going to be pretty critical because when you are applying the technologies, you want to make sure that your technology is enabling your process, not necessarily dictating it. So some of the questions that I would have are you using multiple ERP systems, or are you using multiple vendor technologies for your service center? I know I had one client recently where HR was on one particular service management platform and IT was on another, yet they were still trying to run a multifunction service center, and it was very difficult, as you can imagine. When we talk about integration, again, how is your technology integrated across your organization? So are you using, direct point-to-point connectors? Is there middleware that's involved? Thinking about what makes sense for your organization and the technology landscape that's applicable. Customer feedback. So again, taking this to the next level, it's not just about getting the feedback, it's how to get it. So obviously we're talking surveys, but thinking about the frequencies of surveys sent, your rating scales that you want to use, and open text versus open text fields. What's the ease of the submission like? And then probably most importantly, what are you doing in terms of when you actually get the feedback? Are you acting on it? Is a continuous improvement team, really triaging some of these areas, or how are they following up with the employee when it comes to that service recovery piece? When we talk about innovation, again, obviously technology is tied to innovation clearly. So thinking about any of like the disruptive technologies that are really becoming pretty prevalent. Technology roadmap. So again, as leaders, what's the next step in your technology roadmap? Is it maybe evaluating chat or incorporating chat as part of your offering for the service center? Is it moving from a single function to a multifunction portal? And obviously across your whole shared services organization as well. So what other technologies are being evaluated that will impact your organization? And then the last is around, again, your single point of access for employees. So really, I think of this primarily as your employee portal, and then that obviously incorporates the larger service management technology space as well. And really, we're going to be focusing a bit more. Oh, there we go. So with portals, you can see here one of the first bullet. A lot of the top performing companies that we see average 2 times the number of portal hits per employee versus some of the comparison companies from our survey. And so obviously getting a chance to incorporate an employee portal, it allows your employees to get some of those basic questions answered via your self-service or direct access, ideally to a knowledge base. They're also, at that point, your employees are able to submit those queries or requests when it comes to, again, self-service and direct access to the website. In addition, employees are obviously going to be able to get a chance to call in as well. What I think your employees can stop doing is having to wonder what the status of their query or inquiry is, not needing to leave just a blank message, knowing that maybe they will get answered, maybe they won't. And so on the right side, you can see some of the top performers versus our comparative group. What we would consider as a robust portal is really those areas in gray, blue, and orange, where you can see that the gray area is really personalized content that is being displayed for your employees with full system integration. So, two-way connectors between, let's say, your service management technology and ideally your HRIS system. That blue section, which is where a lot of organizations sit, are again that personalized content, but maybe a little bit of a more limited system integration. And then last would be, again, in the orange, some personalization of content without system integration. And when I think of personalized content, I'm thinking, is it information that's being displayed if, let's say, you're a union employee for that specific union, or if you're a manager of people, are there manager specific like knowledge-based articles that you're able to leverage, and that it would only be showing up for you. So getting to the case study, one of our clients, it was a pretty interesting case study. They had a IT shared services organization, and they wanted to move to a multifunction, and so their employee portal was really only IT driven, and they really wanted to incorporate the HR aspect of it. And so really our objective was, how do we create that single unified employee portal for everyone? And so our approach, we really evaluated some of the key design decisions. So thinking about the look and feel, and then thinking about the governance. So we thought about the shared real estate. So just laying out the information for HR and IT. Notifications, understanding the look and feel, because as you can imagine, sometimes IT has differing opinions in terms of notifications and the frequency and ease of understanding some of the communications that are going out. Enabling chat. IT had chat, and HR didn't feel like they were quite ready to go live with chat right when they were starting out. So understanding the nuances of what it would take to enable chat. Introducing mobile capabilities. Obviously, that's something that a lot of our clients it's not a nice to have at this moment, it's a must have. And then, I really focused a bit more on the look and feel for the employees, but certainly for the fulfiller side as well. So understanding all of the different functionality along like case statuses or priorities, some of the dashboards that would be available along with some of the survey management. When it comes to governance, you're thinking, what's your ownership between HR and IT, and who owns what? Understanding your system maintenance and when's the right timing for those upgrades. Driving some more role-based access. So at the time, the IT portal was not integrated to the ERP, and now that they wanted to integrate it to their ERP, how are we able to take advantage of that role-based access? Reporting and metrics, and then of course any other future enhancements as well. And so just a quick look. This is where we ended up landing, and so we tried to, I think, keep it really simple. You can see here on the left side, we decided to move forward with a popular items that included both HR and IT services, but then afterwards you can always click into either their EIS or their human resources tab, and then you can start to drill down specifically into IT or HR needs after that. Just from a timing standpoint, I'm going to go ahead and push through and try and cover the data and knowledge piece, and then afterwards we'll open it up for questions if that's okay. So we're thinking about data and knowledge. Again, we're thinking about the metrics, the reporting and the analytics, some of the knowledge content that's available, any kind of operational performance around like SLAs, and then clearly your data management and your security piece. So some of the key levers when it comes to data and knowledge. So obviously, again, your knowledge base. We already spoke about this already. So it's really important to obviously have a robust and knowledge base, but also thinking about the maintenance aspect and not letting those articles sour. The second is, again, your service catalog, so your repository of e-forms, but then also just your larger scope of services as well. When we think service level agreements, SLAs, it's being able to set those clear and reasonable expectations between your HRSS organization and your customers. But it's also about your HRSS organization, internally. So all of the different delivery channels and what those service level metrics and reporting. I think that's a pretty standard one. Analytics, so we're obviously seeing a lot of clients starting to stand up an analytics COE to really help parse and pull data out and ultimately understand what are some of those meaningful insights that they're able to discover. And then last, around data management and security. Obviously, PII is very important. Again, we're seeing more and more companies moving towards more of that MFA or multi-factor authentication when it comes to logging in. So, further needs for encryption and not just for communications, but also attachments that are coming into the service center. So, a clear piece when it comes to data and knowledge is how do you manage it, and oftentimes what we feel is that that onus oftentimes sits in that operational support team or like a continuous improvement team, where they're typically in charge of those metrics, the knowledge-based maintenance, a lot of that system management, training and change management as well. So being able to liaise with some of those business units outside and understand what's going on in the field. Quality management for sure, and then obviously just your general continuous improvement, looking at a lot of the processes and understanding what's working and what's not working. So case study, this was a pretty interesting case study. We were working with a large beverage manufacturer implementing a brand new ERP system, full suite of service management technologies, and a whole new operating model, that being the shared services model. And right on go live, for those first 2 or 3 weeks, we found that the case volumes that we estimated going live were significantly higher than what we thought. And really, this was growing at kind of an unsustainable rate. And so our objective is, within that hypercare period, how do we quickly drive down that backlog, but then also ultimately drive down your daily case submissions as well in order to increase your tier 1 efficiency. So our approach, we looked at this from a short term and then from a mid to long term. So what we did was we really, again, leveraged that continuous improvement team to build a lot of new individual or team dashboards that were focused on an updated or prioritized set of metrics. What we really ended up focusing on is understanding what the case pipeline is, so your new cases, your open cases, your pending cases, and or what was holding up a lot of these cases. We also leveraged the continuous improvement team to help with categorizing in the short term some of those general cases that didn't really have any context when it came to the submission. And then lastly, standing up an agile team that really handled some of the more complex case types. And that agile team was composed of HR generalists that spearheaded it, and that really helped free up some of the tier 1 time. And so from a midterm to longer term, just to point out a few of these, conducting retraining was important. We really focused on some of the most efficient tier 1s and understanding what they were doing and what worked for them, and then retraining the rest of the tier 1s based on what we have learned. Rewarding performance. So, again, it sounds simple, but it's an important aspect that keeps people motivated. Proactive communications, making sure that, again, that continuous improvement team was going out to the different COEs and understanding, hey, what's coming down the pipeline, so we can push information out and get ahead of what we know inquiries are going to be coming in for. So And really, so the results, after a short period of time, we were really able to increase our tier 1 average caseload efficiency by about 50%. We started to really identify the large buckets of light cases, and then actively start to push out communications to mitigate future queries, and then really leveraging more of the workflow and automating as much as possible. So with that, I think we are right at time. And so for wrap up, I'm going to pass it back to Courtney. But
Okay.
I think at this point too, any questions as well, Alyssa?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that we do have a few questions that are going to take some time to answer, but I also think would be really of interest to the entire audience. So I wanted to propose if we could send those questions to all of you, Courtney, Jonathan, Trish, have you answer those, and we could send those out via the follow-up email. Would that work on your end?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, great. I'll let you go ahead, Courtney.
Okay, great, thank you. Just in conclusion, first of all, thank you again for joining us today. Hopefully you took some good information from the materials. You'll have the materials as well if further things come up. I did want to take just a quick moment to promote the ongoing benchmarking study that we have. It's in process now with ourselves and APQC. You can see the information here. It is really a wealth of information. It's free, and it is due by the end of June. So if you are interested, you can access the study, and the link is here. And we really encourage you. There's a lot of unbelievably helpful information, and it really allows you to compare yourself to your peers. So that's my plug for that. And again, we just want to thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you so much, Courtney, Jonathan, and Trish. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Madison, who is going to close out the webinar for us.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. This is a great presentation. As they mentioned earlier, we do have their contact information also included in the slide deck. And then if you don't already, follow our Human Capital Management Expertise page. We have the latest updates with research there. And then if you have any additional questions for APQC or about our research, feel free to contact Alyssa Tucker. Connect with us on social, and I just want to thank everyone for joining, and we'll follow up with the details that Alyssa mentioned. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.